Imagine stepping onto a street and seeing an ordinary man in a hoodie and a modern haircut. He looks just like any of us, no pronounced brow ridges, no sloping skull. Yet he belongs to a time far earlier than we can picture. That is what the remains uncovered at Jebel Irhoud in Morocco reveal. About 315,000 years ago, long before deserts shaped the landscape as they do today, a lush plain teemed with gazelles, zebras, rhinos, and early humans. The story began by chance in 1954, when miners searching for borite stumbled upon a skull. Initially, they thought the find was relatively recent, perhaps belonging to prehistoric ancestors, but later excavations proved otherwise. Decades of careful work unearthed not just one skull, but several individuals, including children, alongside a scatter of stone tools that resembled an ancient hunting camp. For years, the age of the site remained uncertain, with estimates ranging from 40 to 70,000 years. It wasn't until 2017 that thermoluminescence dating of the tools and electron paramagnetic resonance analysis of the teeth converged on a precise age of roughly 315,000 years. The faces of these hominins are strikingly modern, flat, with low cheekbones and rounded jaws, so much so that, if you imagined the soft tissue, they would look almost familiar. Yet the overall shape of their cranium tells a different story. Their skulls are elongated and more primitive than those of today's humans, indicating that the modern facial features appeared before the brain case took its present form. What's also notable is what the archaeological record does not show. There are no signs of symbolic behavior, no art, no burial rites, no personal ornaments. The people of Jebel Irhoud, however, produced sophisticated Middle Stone Age tools, pointed implements, scrapers, and spearheads that demonstrate a high level of skill and planning. In short, the Jebel Irhoud findings paint a picture of early Homo sapiens who looked much like us in the face but still carried a brain and cultural habits that were evolving. Their legacy reminds us that the journey toward modern humanity was gradual, marked by incremental changes in anatomy and technology long before the emergence of symbolic thought. For tens of thousands of years after the first hominins appeared, there is no sign of a symbolic revolution. Their bodies were fully human, hands capable of fine movements, speech organs suited for language, eyes that could perceive the world. But their behavior seemed muted, as if something essential was missing. This raises a stark question. Why did the earliest intelligent people display so little of what we now define as human? The oldest remains that can be assigned to our species come from Jebel Irhoud. These fossils are not from a single, isolated group. Instead, growing evidence shows that modern humans did not emerge from one point, but from a web of populations scattered across Africa, exchanging genes, knowledge, and survival strategies over tens of thousands of years. According to the weakly structured ancestral model, about 1.5 million years ago, a common ancestor split into at least 2 African groups. These lineages lived apart for a long time, forming distinct genetic lines, yet they continued to intermix intermittently. Roughly 300,000 years ago, they converged again, producing Homo sapiens as a braided, not linear lineage. Regardless of this genetic complexity, the archaeological record remains starkly empty. For hundreds of thousands of years after Jebel Irhoud, art is virtually absent. No musical instruments, no engraved stones, no figurines. Nothing that resembles religion, myth, or narrative. The people made tools, hunted, ate, and raised children, but any dreams or stories they might have had left no trace. Some anthropologists argue that the lack of evidence does not prove absence. Early culture likely relied on perishable materials, wood, plant fibers, feathers, pigments that have not survived. They may have woven baskets, carved wooden idols, painted bodies with ochre, or told stories under the stars, only for those expressions to vanish under erosion, wind, and rain. The contrast becomes striking when we look at the period about 50,000 years ago. Suddenly, there is an explosion of cave paintings, bone flutes, complex burials, and mythic motifs, material preserved in stone, bone, and pigment. The Jebel Irhoud people, by comparison, were quieter and more modest. Yet even they displayed sophisticated stoneworking. Their tools were made with the prepared core technique, allowing predictable removal of flakes. They produced sharp spearheads, skin scrapers, and blades that could be hafted onto wooden shafts. This was not primitive craftsmanship. It reflected forward planning and engineering, thinking several steps ahead. We find no symbols, decorations, or ornaments on the graves, nothing that suggests the dead were seen as anything more than remains. That absence is the paradox of the first truly intelligent people. Their brains were modern in shape, yet their minds didn't yet turn imagination into external objects. One theory says their neural architecture wasn't yet tuned for symbolic thought. The elongated, less spherical brains of the Jebel Irhoud inhabitants hinted a different neuroanatomy that delayed recursion, abstraction, and symbolism. Another view blames the environment. Tiny, constantly pressured groups simply didn't have the chance to build a complex culture. When survival hangs by a thread, there's little room for art. A demographic hypothesis adds that symbolic innovation needs a population large enough to preserve and transmit it. In a band of 30, a brilliant idea can vanish with its creator. Language, myths, and memory are fragile in such small communities. They require numbers, connections, and constant interaction. A more unsettling proposition is that the mind was already equipped for myth-making and meaning-seeking, but the people had no need to express it outwardly. Their inner worlds stayed personal, never etched onto bone. This raises a puzzling question. Is the creation of symbols inevitable, or does it require a rare mix of environmental pressure, opportunity, and social structure? If the latter, the symbolic humanity we know might be a chance accident. The world could be full of beings that look like us, hunt, eat, sleep, reproduce, and die, yet leave no trace of beliefs. Jebel Irhoud gives us fossils with brains almost like ours, but the narrative fire had not yet caught. No myths, no spirits, no sense of future, only a faint awakening. The lingering question is why the silence broke after roughly 50,000 years. Human history seems to have begun more than once. There is no single moment when the first intelligent person opened their eyes to the world we now recognize. Instead, we discover scattered pieces of a strange, unfinished puzzle. Modern humans already had a fully modern anatomy more than 250,000 years ago across Africa, yet their culture took many millennia to appear. At Florisbad in South Africa, dated to about 260,000 years ago, archaeologists uncovered a partial skull with a flat face, round cheeks, and a huge brain case. The face looks like ours, but the cranium is larger and retains archaic traits, a true mosaic of modern and ancient features. The site yielded Middle Stone Age tools that are sophisticated and functional, but no symbols, decorations, or graves. Further north, The Omo River region of Ethiopia produced the Omo 1 specimen, dated to roughly 205 to 195,000 years ago. This skull is unmistakably modern. High forehead, chin, and a rounded cranium that would not raise eyebrows on a CT scan. Again, only simple stone tools were found, with no artistic objects. Around 160,000 years ago at Herto, also in Ethiopia, a family of 2 adults and a child was recovered. Their skulls are modern in overall shape, but keep strong archaic characteristics: prominent brow ridges, large teeth, and thick bone. Some researchers label them Homo sapiens idaltu, an early form of our species. The child's cranium bears neat cut marks, suggesting post-mortem processing that could reflect ritual behavior, early ancestor veneration, or even cannibalism. Putting these finds together, the picture emerges of a wide, interconnected web of Homo sapiens between 300 and 150,000 years ago. Populations stretched from Morocco to South Africa, Ethiopia, and Tanzania, living largely in isolation but occasionally exchanging genes, tools, and perhaps ideas. Genetic evidence supports this braided river model rather than a simple branching tree. For almost 250,000 years, early humans possessed modern bodies, dexterous hands, a vocal apparatus capable of complex speech, and brains that were no smaller and sometimes larger than ours. Yet they left no cave paintings, musical instruments, bone flutes, or ivory figurines. The record is essentially silent. One explanation points to the stability of their environment. When populations are tiny and the climate remains steady, natural selection provides little incentive for innovation. If the world does not demand change, culture remains static. Small groups have no pressing need to invent elaborate myths or sophisticated weapons. They simply continue using what already works. A second line of thought focuses on demography. Culture depends not only on individual minds, but also on collective memory. Memory, however, requires a network of people to transmit it. A solitary genius may create something new, but if the community is too small, the invention vanishes with the inventor's death. Researchers call this cultural drift, the accidental loss of information in tiny populations. A new hunting technique, a story, or a ritual can disappear within a single generation when the group cannot preserve it. Neuroscientists offer a third hypothesis. Early human brains already matched modern brain volume, but their shape differed. Fossils from Dmanisi reveal elongated crania more akin to earlier hominins, whereas the rounded, compact skulls typical of modern humans appear only after the 100,000-year mark. Some scholars argue that this globularization reflects internal restructuring needed for recursive language, abstract thought, and symbolic representation. If true, the neural groundwork for myths and metaphors existed long before they were expressed in material form. A more unsettling possibility is that the capacity for culture, art, language, and religion was present, but early humans simply did not use it. Consider the San of southern Africa, one of the world's oldest continuous cultures, who encode vast environmental knowledge in songs, stories, and rituals. Such traditions become essential only when memory must serve as the primary repository of information. In a world where water, food, and shelter are constantly available, the pressure to create external records, paintings, beads, stone carvings, is reduced. Knowledge stays within bodies, motor memory, and oral transmission, leaving little trace for archaeologists. Compounding this fragility is the fact that 99% of early material culture consisted of perishable items: fibers, wood, leather, plant dyes, and the spoken word. All of these have vanished. It is entirely plausible that early humans were intelligent, symbolic beings whose cultural expressions were made of materials the earth does not preserve. Their minds may not yet have turned inward as ours do today. Death remained death, stars were merely lights, wind was simply wind, and the boundary between mere existence and meaningful symbolism had not yet been crossed. Across sites such as Jebel Irhoud, Florisbad, Omo Kibish, and Herto, we repeatedly find modern-looking bodies and practical tools with only occasional hints of something deeper. The spark that would ignite a cultural leap never quite caught fire, yet. For 100,000 years, Homo sapiens possessed the essential parts: capable hands, a developed brain, and a voice. But the pattern that would bind them together remained unfinished. What held them back? A suitable environment, a critical population size, a neurological breakthrough, a random burst of insight, or simply a human life that did not yet need myths? Whatever the cause, the wick was already set. Conditions were forming, and something was looming on the horizon. The lingering question for later history is why the change finally erupted 50,000 years ago. By 200 to 250,000 years ago, the biological foundation, bones, hands, brain, speech apparatus, and upright gait, was complete. Homo sapiens was no longer a promise of the future. We were already walking, hunting, and building. The mental machinery was assembled, yet something essential was still missing. The archaeological record of this period, the Middle Stone Age, is both astonishing and stark. Technological progress was as dramatic as the invention of the telephone, only stretched across tens of thousands of years. The ancient tradition of hand axes, dominant for over 1 million years, gave way to precise, standardized tools and, crucially, composite instruments. For the first time, people fused different materials: stone tips glued to wooden shafts with plant resin and tendons, creating spears far superior to earlier weapons. Such composites appear at Katupan in South Africa, where stone spearheads dating back 500,000 years have been found. By around 250,000 years ago, this technology became true engineering art. Stones were deliberately heated, shaped aerodynamically, and fitted into complex tools. Controlled fire was then employed not just for cooking, but to transform stone itself. At Pint's Point, archaeologists discovered that heating silkrete to the right temperature made it fracture cleanly, yielding sharper, more reliable implements, an early application of materials science. Too little heat left the stone fragile. Too much caused it to shatter. Mastery of this process required careful observation, repeated experimentation, and reliable transmission across generations. Thus, early humans watched the world closely, preserved subtle knowledge, and prepared the ground for the cultural explosion that would later reshape our species. Early modern humans mastered fire, stone, wood, sinews, and resins, turning them into weapons and tools. They hunted in coordinated groups, gathered shellfish along coasts, built shelters, harvested medicinal plants, and may even have fashioned simple beds. Yet they left no unmistakable symbols. No cave paintings, music, figurines, or burial rites that later societies would recognize as cultural expression. One of the oldest pigments, ochre, offers a tantalizing hint of symbolic activity. At sites such as Blombos in South Africa, archaeologists have uncovered ochre pieces over 200,000 years old, ground into powder and clearly processed. The safest explanation treats the pigment as a practical resource, an insect repellent, a leather tanning agent, or a disinfectant, uses still observed among some contemporary hunter-gatherers. Whether the ochre was also used to paint bodies, mark affiliations, or adorn objects remains unknowable. The traces of application have not survived. If it colored organic materials, they have long since decayed. If it marked stone, the markings have not been preserved. This gap is like a recipe without the dish. Some scholars view ochre as the seed of symbolism, an early sign that culture was awakening. However, it would be decades before clear symbolic artifacts appear. Beads, carved ornaments, abstract geometric designs, and extensive cave paintings that depict animals, spirits, and mythic narratives emerging around 40 to 50,000 years ago. Nevertheless, the cognitive abilities of these earlier peoples were evident in their subsistence strategies. Sites such as Classis, Rivermount, and Pinkle Point reveal systematic mollusk collection, a practice that required precise knowledge of tides, seasons, and local ecology, implying long-term settlement and planning. Evidence of driven hunts, herding animals into natural traps or cliffs, shows coordinated ambushes, bait use, and sophisticated communication, underscoring advanced foresight and engineering. The recurring puzzle is why such complex minds left so few symbolic traces. One explanation points to demography. Cultural evolution depends on dense networks of interaction. During the Middle Stone Age, African populations were sparsely scattered across a vast continent. Genetic studies suggest that at various times the global human population may have been fewer than 100,000 individuals. This demographic ratchet model proposes that limited population size constrained the spread and retention of symbolic behavior, delaying the emergence of the rich artistic record we later associate with modern humans. Imagine a world of only 10,000 fertile humans, a population the size of a small town. A single drought, epidemic, or war could wipe out entire lineages. In such a fragile setting, information disappears quickly, cultures reset, and myths fade into silence. One perspective questions the assumption that symbolic behavior must leave physical traces. We might be searching for the wrong evidence. In societies where memory lives in songs, dances, and seasonal rituals rather than on bone or stone, meaning exists, but the earth does not preserve it. Another unsettling idea is that the rise of symbolism was not inevitable. Culture may not have been a direct result of larger brains. Instead, it could have emerged from a specific turning point, a cultural mutation, or a random mix of environment, population density, and pressures. In that moment, practicality turned into symbolism, tools into totems. Technological limits have already been pushed far back. The earliest known sustainable stoneworking technique involved shaping stone not by hammer blows, but by precise pressure applied with bone or horn tools, producing thinner, sharper, more reliable blades. Moving from simple percussion to controlled pressure required a mental model of material behavior. People stopped merely reacting to their surroundings. They began to predict and reshape them. Yet the weapons, spears, shelters, remain silent. For almost 50,000 years, between roughly 250,000 and 200,000 years ago, humanity existed in a strange, borderline state. Our bodies were fully human, capable of fire, stone, and wood, and we possessed a desire to alter the landscape. Still, there is no lasting record of myths or sacred symbols, a mind that looks outward but fails to leave a symbolic imprint. It's like building a fire. Kindling is stacked, sparks flicker, but the flame does not catch yet. Each archaeological find, a fossil, a stone tool, asks the same question. Why did fire ignite only 50,000 years ago? During that interval, our ancestors seemed more concerned with silence than survival. Examining their bones, brow ridges, cranial vaults, pelvic tilt, shows us fully human bodies. Modern skull shapes, precise hands, speech apparatus tuned for language, brain sizes within today's range. Yet something is missing, not in the tools, but in the mind. This paradox defines the Middle Stone Age. Blades grew sharper, spears straighter, fires hotter, but the symbolic record remains hauntingly empty. Technology advanced, while the mind stayed mute. Consider the findings at Pinnacle Point in southern Africa. Heat-treated stone tools date back about 164,000 years. This indicates a deliberate chemical process, not instinctual behavior. In order to make a weapon work, early people had to gather the right fuel, control temperature, and know which stones would split cleanly and which would shatter. A single mistake could ruin not just one tool, but an entire production line, laboratory-like thinking in a Paleolithic setting. Take the Blombos Cave, where roughly 200,000 years ago, humans created real composite adhesives. They ground red ochre into a powder, mixed it with plant resin, and produced a durable, weatherproof bonding agent for attaching stone blades to wooden shafts. Modern experimental archaeologists have tried to reproduce this recipe, discovering that it demands precise control of fire, humidity, and component ratios. Too much resin makes the mixture brittle. Too much ochre prevents it from hardening. These are not random trials, but deliberate engineering based on an understanding of material properties. Yet despite such technical skill, there is no clear evidence of art, statues, painted walls, carved flutes, or ritual burials from that period. Hands were busy and minds sharp, and landscapes were reshaped by fire, hunting, and resource management. But the inner symbolic world left little trace. This missing mind is puzzling because the neuroanatomy of Homo sapiens was already modern in size and likely in function 200,000 years ago. The brain, however, is not just hardware. It also runs a program that may have lagged behind. One theory argues that symbolism did exist, but was expressed in perishable media: body paint, tattoos, decorated leather, dances, songs, and oral stories that simply did not survive. The apparent emptiness would then be a preservation bias, not a lack of imagination. Another view suggests that early technology was still purely functional, lacking cultural meaning. A spear was just a spear, a resin just a glue, without myths or spirit. Anthropologist Nicholas Knorr describes the shift to symbolic behavior as a cognitive threshold. After crossing it, people begin to see symbols rather than just objects, turning a pen from a simple tool into a personal sign, or red pigment from an insect repellent into a symbol of blood or luck. Between 200 and 250,000 years ago, this threshold had not yet been reached. Some scholars think the barrier lies in scale. Technical skills can be transmitted within small groups, but symbolic systems, language, myths, and religions require larger networks and multiple custodians to survive. If a storyteller dies, the story must live on elsewhere, otherwise the symbolic tradition disappears. Culture grows through repetition, not through a single genius. Genetic evidence shows that early Homo sapiens lived in tiny, isolated groups. Bottlenecks may have reduced the total population to fewer than 10,000 individuals, with groups separated by weeks or months of travel. In such conditions, the loss of knowledge was almost inevitable. We see the same pattern today. Languages of isolated communities can disappear within a generation. Oral histories vanish when the last elder dies, and rituals fade if the sole keeper leaves no apprentice. Cultural drift functions like entropy. Ecology also played a role. Ancient Africa was a patchwork of ultra-arid deserts, dense tropical forests, and shifting grasslands. Survival meant a constant battle with drought, flood, famine, and fire, so dedicating mental energy to abstract symbols was a luxury. Most of the mind's effort went toward finding water, tracking prey, avoiding predators, and reading the landscape. The spiritual world could wait, but could it truly afford to? Tools without culture are merely tools. Knowledge without memory becomes a skill, not a story or a myth. Yet signs of change appear. In a high mountain cave on the border of South Africa and Eswatini, archaeologists uncovered plant material dating back roughly 200,000 years. The remains aren't random debris. They include fragrant leaves chosen for their insect-repelling properties, early chemistry, comfort engineering, even sleep taming. Shell fragments and ostrich eggshells suggest the earliest water containers, a breakthrough that let people hunt longer, travel farther, and break the dependence on rivers. Despite these advances, symbolic expression remains absent. No carvings or drawings, only practical transformations. Somewhere between 200 and 250,000 years ago, humanity stood on a threshold. Bones, hands, and brains were ready, but the modern mind's spark had not yet ignited. What held us back? Low population numbers, harsh environments, or simply the lack of a coinciding need for myth-making? A spear can fell a buffalo, fire can cook meat and warm shelter, but only stories survive across millennia. The lingering question is whether technology alone is enough when no one remembers the stories that give it meaning. The spark has not yet flared, but the wind is changing, hinting that something is approaching. If the earliest chapters of Homo sapiens were written with bone and fire, the next are being shaped by wind, sea, and the relentless chaos of the planet. Between 200 and 150 years ago, Africa entered a cycle of near extinction, as if the climate itself repeatedly tested humanity's survival. Beyond fossils, ocean sediments, ice cores, and lake bottoms reveal a pattern of extreme volatility. During the Pleistocene, a planetary ice age lasting over 2 million years, massive northern glaciers raised sea levels by up to 130 meters. Though the ice never reached Africa, it altered rainfall and monsoons, causing whole regions to swing from lush green to barren desert and back. Lake Malawi's bottom cores show that between 135 and 70,000 years ago, the lake almost completely dried out repeatedly, shrinking from a surface larger than Lebanon to a mere puddle. This was driven by a weakened or vanished African monsoon, producing century-long apocalypses that made much of East and Southern Africa nearly uninhabitable. Rivers stopped, forests died, wildlife vanished, and early Homo sapiens faced only two options: move or perish. Climate records over 50,000 years indicate repeated superdroughts punctuated by brief, unpredictable wet spells. Each swing shattered ecosystems, forced migrations, fragmented populations, and erased knowledge networks.
Archaeology confirms this. Middle Stone Age sites appear, disappear for tens of thousands of years, then reappear hundreds or thousands of kilometers away, not because tool-making stopped, but because the land became unlivable. A stark example is the Sahara, today the world's largest hot desert, which during parts of the Pleistocene was a green corridor of grasslands, lakes and rivers teeming with life, only to revert to sand and death almost overnight. Hunter-gatherers on its edge could watch their world turn to dust within a generation, as water vanished and plants died, collapsing their cultural system. Imagine the psychological toll. A single year of drought is a disaster today,
Now picture a century of unending dryness, where grandchildren never see rain. The lake slowly improves, but fish die, trees become bare, and animals flee, never to return. Each ecological collapse gathers people, yet groups fall apart, unions dissolve, and knowledge transmission stops. Oral histories vanish with elders who die of hunger, and stories of Earth fade as the planet becomes unrecognizable. Genetics confirms this. Mitochondrial and Y chromosome studies reveal a bottleneck that may have shrunk Homo sapiens to fewer than 10,000 breeding individuals, some estimates as low as 2,000. The species hovered on the brink, with fewer people than could fill a modern arena, almost disappearing but somehow persisting. Coastal peoples recall shelters like Pinkle Point in South Africa. While interiors turned to dust, narrow coastal strips became lifeboats. Reliance on shellfish, tidal pools, algae, and sustainable ocean resources forged a true revolution, demanding new tools, knowledge, and mental maps of tides, lunar cycles, waves, and storms. The marine environment tolerates drought better. When land burns, the ocean preserves remains. This shift from land-only hunting to exploiting multiple ecosystems sparked a more complex culture. Archaeology still shows fragility. Coastal shelters were thin strips between sea and desert. Rising seas, shrinking land, worsening drought, and disappearing resources left a tiny safety margin. In that crucible, climate chaos shaped the modern human genome, teaching each generation to adapt, making adaptability the key skill as homes could vanish while people lived. Sustainable symbolic culture requires intelligence, stability, time, connections, and predictability. In a world where rivers disappear, forests become cemeteries, and mountains dead ends, narrative space may vanish. Yet amid planetary destruction and recovery, the first sparks of symbolic thought appeared. When familiar surroundings fade, memory becomes a survival tool. History can guide us to water, and songs about extinct animals become maps, not mere entertainment. Anthropologists note that modern hunter-gatherer cosmologies are both spiritual and encyclopedic. The Sand People recorded precise details about water sources, migration routes, and seasonal changes. Australian Aboriginal stories turn dreams of time into narrative maps that shape the landscape. In a stable world, this is art. In an unstable one, it is survival. Beneath the surface, a silent memory formed, not carved on bone or painted on walls, but kept in minds, spoken aloud, and expressed through movement. Yet droughts persisted. Ice expanded in the north, monsoons weakened, and Homo sapiens clung to life by the thinnest threads. Each generation was a gamble, every move a toss of a coin. A massive bottleneck loomed, a disaster capable of darkening the sky and pushing humanity nearer to extinction than ever before. That disaster arrived with the eruption of the supervolcano on Sumatra, known as Mount Toba, about 74,000 years ago. The blast was not a simple collapse. It expelled more than 2,800 cubic kilometers of ash and rock, a volume unimaginable, like turning every skyscraper on Earth into dust and then multiplying it 100 times. The crater remains today as Lake Toba, a lake roughly the size of Luxembourg, a lingering wound on the planet. Ash clouds spread across the globe, reaching the Arabian Peninsula. Sulfur aerosols rose into the stratosphere, blocking sunlight and dropping average global temperatures by 3 to 5 degrees, with even sharper declines in some regions. It was not a winter, but a volcanic winter that could have lasted years. Agriculture was non-existent, so hunter-gatherers lost the plants, herbivores, and fish they relied on. Genetic studies of modern humans reveal an unusually low mitochondrial diversity, suggesting that the human family tree once passed through a very narrow funnel. Some models estimate that the world population may have fallen to fewer than 3,000 individuals, perhaps only a few hundred breeding pairs, fewer than the students in a single modern classroom.
At such numbers, a single harsh winter, a failed hunt, or a new disease could have erased us completely. The episode starkly reminds us how fragile our species truly is. The whole story of consciousness and the universe seems to hinge on a world that might have lacked bark, fire, radio telescopes, and even this conversation. Yet the Toba bottleneck was not purely a genetic accident. It was written into the earth itself. In South Asia, entire sites are buried beneath layers of volcanic ash. At Jvallopuram in India, a grey-white scar in the soil marks this layer. Stone tools lie both below and above it, though the ones above are fewer and more scattered. The record thins, as if fewer hands were shaping the artifacts. But the tools on either side of the ash are essentially the same. There is no obvious technological rollback. Survivors did not lose their skills. Even under a planetary catastrophe, human mental abilities remained. We simply became a smaller population. For decades, anthropologists have debated whether the Toba eruption caused the genetic bottleneck directly or merely marked a chapter in a longer period of instability driven by the harsh climate of the Pleistocene. Some geneticists argue that the reduction began earlier, during the severe droughts between 135 and 70,000 years ago. Others see Toba as the final nail in the coffin of an already fragile balance. In any case, societies fragmented into scattered remnants. Isolated groups clung to coasts, mountain shelters, caves, and followed herds across dry plains. All modern family lines trace back to those survivors. Every language, song, face, and act of love, war, or curiosity is a thread that never broke. A more unsettling conclusion is that the Toba event may not have been isolated. Climate shifted so dramatically that collapses and recoveries became the rule rather than the exception. Genomic data and ancient DNA modeling show that humans never formed a single massive pan-African population. Instead, they existed as a constellation of small, often isolated groups, linked by occasional migration corridors and sometimes cut off for thousands of years. This explains why fossils from the era differ so much. Skulls from Khartoum in Ethiopia differ from those found at Omo Kibish, and faces from Jebel Irhoud in Morocco differ from remains at Florisbad in South Africa. We were one species, but barely. This fragmentation reshapes our view of human history. The notion of a single homeland sparking modernity appears illusory. Survival bound diverse groups together, each developing its own tools, strategies, and ways of being. Some experiments ended in dead ends. Others forged connections and exchanges across hundreds of kilometers, laying the groundwork for the symbolic world we inherit today. Anthropologists argue that surviving the Toba bottleneck forced humanity to invent public practices that later formed the core of symbolic culture. When only a handful of people remain, every connection becomes vital. Alliances decide whether a group disappears or persists. As boundaries between groups blur, rituals strengthen communal identity.
turning spiritual acts into practical methods. The basic survival equation is simple. A spear kills a gazelle. Fire cooks the meat. Yet to endure years without reliable resources, people must rely on trust, cooperation, and a shared sense of belonging. Memory itself turns into an evolutionary edge, recalling who helped, who betrayed, and where water still flows proves as crucial as knowing how to sharpen a blade. In this climate, the first flickers of myth appear, not as cave art, but as rules, codes, and songs, urging groups to stay together, remember their place, trust their kin, and beware of outsiders. This symbolic layer was grafted onto the practical need to survive, but it had not yet exploded into the full symbolic mind that later produced European cave paintings, African shell beads, and Siberian figurines. The spark was not fire, but dry brushwood waiting to be kindled. Later survivors of the Toba event, or of subsequent climate upheavals, began to view life as a slow, painful, generational process. Fragile strands of knowledge, memory, and meaning intertwined, prompting a change that no climate model, gene sequence, or fossil could forecast. The mind itself ignited. Humanity moved beyond mere survival, starting to imagine, dream, and leave invisible traces that we now see on walls, in caves, on beads, and in bones. One such trace, not a tool or weapon, but an abstract pattern of intersecting lines scratched on ochre, dates to at least 75,000 years ago. Discovered deep in Blombos Cave on the southern tip of Africa, the engraving shows intentional design, marking the earliest known imprint of a symbolic mind. Its exact purpose, whether a card, an accessory, a prayer, or a memory, remains unknown, but it stands as the first clear sign of symbolic thought. If we look back to roughly 150 to 130,000 years ago, the climate was recovering from a severe super drought. Coastal ecosystems flourished, while inland areas struggled, prompting people to settle along the edges of land and sea, where the foundations of symbolic culture were beginning to take hold. Among the rocks, caves, and tidal flats of what is now South Africa, people began to survive not just by hunting and gathering, but by learning to read the coast's subtle rhythms, the tide, the moon, even the heat that lingered after a fire. At Knuckle Point near Blombos, archaeologists uncovered a striking find: layers of burnt stone that mark the oldest known controlled use of fire for processing raw material. The fire was used to heat silkrete, a stone that becomes sharper and easier to split after heating, a clear sign that early humans were altering matter at the molecular level, foreshadowing the birth of ceramics and metallurgy for the next 100,000 years. Yet the most intriguing artifacts are not tools, but pigments. Fragments of bright red ochre, rich in iron and the color of blood, show scratches and smears, some with traces of a nasal impression, as if the powder had been mixed with liquid. The ochre was applied to bodies, objects, and walls. The surfaces have vanished, but the pigment remains. In Blombos, abstract engravings appear on several pieces, parallel lines and cross-hatching that hint at an early form of recording, perhaps counting, marking ownership, or expressing family identity. The designs are not writing, but they convey intention. Nearby lie tiny shell beads, each carefully drilled and strung into necklaces or sewn onto clothing. These beads were not decorative luxuries. They acted as symbols of belonging, personal identity, and social difference. Making a bead required drilling, grinding, and stringing, activities that offered no direct survival benefit, yet they carried profound meaning. Here, the abstract becomes portable. Memory is turned into an object that can be worn. The symbolic burst, however, proves fragile. Tracing this behavior through time shows that after a brief flourishing, the engraved ochre and shell beads disappear from the archaeological record. No later layers contain similar artifacts. The paradox is clear. The brain and hands were ready, imagination sparked, but the cultural flame did not take hold. Symbolic intelligence appears in short flashes, then fades, leaving only a whisper of another mind in deep antiquity. The ochre patterns from Blombos Cave, deep in the southern tip of Africa, give us our first glimpse of a mind that created meaning beyond immediate survival. They were not made for hunting, risk, or practical need, but as symbols, perhaps of maps, prayers, memory, or something we may never fully understand. Nonetheless, they remain the earliest surviving trace of symbolic thought, the first imprint of a mind that could think beyond the material world. Between 150 and 130,000 years ago, the climate began to recover after severe super droughts, and coastal zones flourished far more than inland areas. Human groups moved to the edge of the continent, where rocks, caves, and tidal flats offered a new way of life. In addition to hunting and gathering, they learned to read the tides, the moon, and subtle coastal rhythms, allowing them to obtain food even when fires burned on land. At Pinhel Point, near Blombos, archaeologists found layers of burnt stone that reveal the processing of silkrete, a rock that hardens with heat, becoming sharper and easier to split. The most striking discoveries, however, are not tools but pigments. Small pieces of red ochre, an iron-rich earth the color of blood, are scratched, rubbed, and appear to have been mixed with liquid. Some show abstract patterns of parallel lines and cross-hatching, suggesting deliberate marking. Researchers interpret these markings as the earliest attempts at recording, perhaps counting, signaling ownership, denoting family ties, or expressing abstract ideas that we can no longer decode. Nearby, tiny shells have been meticulously drilled and strung into beads, later sewn onto clothing or worn as necklaces and bracelets. Their creation offered no survival advantage. Their value was purely symbolic, turning memory into a portable object. Yet this symbolic behavior was fragile. Engravings and beads appear in some layers, then disappear from later deposits, illustrating a paradox of early Homo sapiens. A ready brain and capable hands, yet cultural fire that flickered without becoming a steady blaze. On the southern African coast, this quiet shift marks the moment when memory began to reshape humanity's gain, sparked by learning the ocean's rhythms. At low tide, stone shelves reveal mussels, clams, and other shellfish, a rich protein source. When the tide returns, the bounty disappears, so extracting it requires knowing the sea's rhythms, linking sky patterns, moon phases, and water movement. This knowledge, not instinct, becomes essential for survival. Huge piles of shells left by early coastal peoples tell a layered story. Generation after generation returned to the same shelves, learned which species to harvest and which to leave so populations could recover. This sustainable practice was an early form of resource management and, in a quiet way, early science, recognizing that the world follows rules that can be learned, remembered, and passed on. The coast also served as a laboratory. At Pinkle Point, archaeologists have found clear evidence that fire was used to heat local silkcrete. When strongly heated, the stone becomes brittle and glassy, cracking predictably and yielding sharper, more effective tools. Such heat treatment is not an accidental discovery. It demands hours of maintaining high temperatures, controlling hearths, managing airflow and fuel. This is the oldest known example of humans deliberately altering a material's molecular structure, a nascent form of metallurgy that required discovery, memorization, and teaching. Yet the archaeological record from this era shows only flickering signs of symbolic behavior and technical thought. Engravings on Blombos ochre stretch for meters, and Jebel Cave yields herb-laden bedding and insect-repellent mats, evidence of health awareness and comfort beyond mere survival. However, these advances remain isolated, never coalescing into a broader cultural complexity. Why did such early innovations not spread? One view points to demographic limits. Even with stable coastal food, populations remained small, hundreds or a few thousand along extensive shorelines. In such groups, the loss of a key elder or specialist could erase crucial knowledge within a generation. Another explanation cites climate. During the 6th marine isotope stage, a brief, favorable window followed harsh glacial and drought periods. For several thousand years, conditions improved, plains expanded, and coasts thrived. But the respite was temporary. Returning aridity collapsed lifelines, reduced populations, and shattered networks. A third, quieter theory suggests this pattern may not be a failure at all, but a rehearsal, a repeated trial that set the stage for later cultural explosions.
If you examine the tools and behavior of that era, you'll see progress isn't a smooth line, but a loop of try, fail, adjust. Microliths, fire-hardened blades, and ochre appear, disappear, then return. Their spread was patchy, sometimes just a few kilometers, sometimes hundreds, never covering the whole globe. It isn't a brain defect. The device existed, but was a fragile program of culture, transmission, and shared memory. Imagine a world where all knowledge lives only in people's heads, no books, drawings, writing, archives. When the woman who knows how to gather shellfish dies, that skill vanishes with her. When the firekeeper falls ill, the ability to harness fires slips back into the ground. This bottleneck of oral culture hit every human group, and only when populations became dense, connected, and stable could memory outlive a single person. Even within that fragility, something remarkable happened. Coastal foragers didn't just survive, they built a different relationship with the earth, mental as well as physical. Shell piles were not waste, but records of abundance and return. The more often a spot was visited, the higher the mound grew, reminding them that grandmothers, grandfathers, and ancestors had lived there, and that the land sustained life. Pigment may have been more than decoration. It could have served as a portable memory, a material center for history. Heated silkcrete blades were not merely sharper tools. They showed the ability to imagine an object's potential transformation. Beads acted as wearable memory, proclaiming, "I belong, I remember, I am part of this." All this memory architecture was not yet a symbolic explosion, but it laid the foundations. When climate shifted again, sea levels fell and food networks collapsed, this knowledge fragmented. Signals dimmed, beads disappeared from layers, ochre use ceased, shell heaps thinned, and focal points cooled. Was this a failed spark or a necessary compression before the later explosion? Memory does not die, it retreats underground, traveling with people who move deep into continents, disperse, and survive. Deep in the hereditary code, in the memory of landscapes and quiet songs, lie forgotten know-how that we will never fully grasp. The next chapter awaits when memory becomes history, and history becomes everything.
Across the windswept plains of Pleistocene Europe, through oak forests, icy margins, and limestone caves from Gibraltar to Siberia, another kind of human walked, 300,000 years before the so-called human explosion. They stood upright, crafted weapons, mastered fire, and buried their dead. Their bones were thick, limbs stocky, faces marked by heavy brow ridges and wide noses that warmed cold air. Yet if you put a jacket and jeans on one of them and meet his eyes, the ancient world feels startlingly close. Neanderthals were not a failed experiment or a primitive cousin of modern humans. Their fossils, dating back roughly 400,000 years, trace a lineage that likely split from an earlier hominin such as Heidelberg man, while Homo sapiens evolved separately in Africa. As the climate swung between relentless glaciations, Neanderthals adapted to Europe and Western Asia, becoming shorter, broader, and more robust, traits suited to a cold, ever-shifting environment. Their toolkits also defy the crude stone chopper stereotype. Using the Levallois technique, they produced standardized sharp blades with minimal waste, crafting spearheads, scrapers, awls, bone implements, and even birch tar adhesives to secure stone to wood. This knowledge was transmitted deliberately, not merely by instinct. Evidence of their social complexity appears in Shanidar Cave, Iraq. About 65,000 years ago, a man with a withered hand, a healed eye socket fracture, and a lingering childhood injury survived into adulthood, an outcome only possible with care from others. Nearby skeletons, one coated in pollen, suggest intentional burial or at least deliberate placement. Cave art further reveals symbolic thought. In Spain's La Pasiega cave, dated to around 65,000 years ago, red ochre markings, strokes, dots, and abstract designs constitute the oldest known European cave paintings, predating modern humans. Deep in France's Bruniquel cave, roughly 176,000 years old, Neanderthals arranged broken stalagmites into concentric circles far from any light source, indicating purposeful activity, perhaps ritual, shelter, or signaling. They also used pigments such as manganese dioxide, applied red and black stains to tools, bones, and walls, and fashioned personal ornaments, including pierced eagle claws dating back 130,000 years. Their diet was versatile. They hunted mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, horses, and bison, while gathering shellfish, pine nuts, and tubers along the Iberian coast. Seasonal migrations of prey prompted them to follow the herds, demonstrating planning abilities. Burial practices, though not universal, occurred often enough to suggest ritual concern for the dead, not just practical disposal. For centuries, Victorian scientists dismissed Neanderthals as clumsy, unintelligent relics, a flyest reflection of their own worldview. Modern research, however, paints a picture of a capable, inventive, and socially sophisticated species that shared many of the hallmarks of humanity. The truth isn't that Neanderthals were primitive, but that they were different. Their brains were as large as ours, sometimes larger, but shaped differently. Flatter occipital lobes suggest an alternative way of processing space, memory, and knowledge. Reconstructed speech apparatus shows they could speak, perhaps less fluid and grammatically complex than modern humans, but capable nonetheless. Their hands were remarkably skilled. Wider, stronger thumbs and robust bases allowed a firm grip, rotational force, and precise work with wood and stone. Yet what of myth, art, and the surge of symbolic thought that marked the human leap around 50,000 years ago? The evidence is faint but telling. Cave drawings, stalagmite rings, a claw necklace, and pollen found in the Shanidar burial all whisper of symbolic cognition. Fire, however, was not a universal shield. Neanderthal groups remained small, local, and only loosely connected, limiting the spread of ideas. Genetic studies confirm their effective population never exceeded a few thousand, making them vulnerable to famine, disease, and random setbacks. Around 60,000 years ago, Homo sapiens left Africa and entered Neanderthal territories. The encounter wasn't a simple war of conquest. It involved interbreeding. Today, every non-African person carries 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA, influencing skin, immunity, fat metabolism, and cold tolerance. Along with genes, they likely exchanged ideas, technologies, fears, and stories. 10 to 15,000 years later, Neanderthals vanished. Advancing ice, shifting ecosystems, and the fragmenting of already tiny groups, combined with competition for resources and mates, pushed them beyond their limits.
Their disappearance isn't a tale of outright defeat, but of fragile populations succumbed to harsh arithmetic. European caves still bear their traces: handprints, ochre, claws, and stone rings etched in darkness. Their legacy lives in our DNA, our bones, and the faint echoes of winters they never saw. Whether their spark was the same fire, a different flame, or a parallel glow remains unanswered, as does the deeper mystery awaiting in Siberian caves, where a tiny Altai bone fragment may rewrite humanity's story. A tiny bone, barely the size of a coin, held a secret nobody expected. When scientists examined its DNA in the year 2010, it didn't match any known Homo sapiens or Neanderthal sequence. The fragment belonged to a Denisovan, a distant branch of the human family. Their remains are scarce: a tooth, a phalanx, a few jaw pieces found in a Tibetan cave, each fitting into a shoebox-sized box. Yet their legacy is huge. Denisovan genes survive today in many peoples of Oceania, Australia, the Philippines, and parts of East and Southeast Asia, sometimes making up as much as 5% of a population's DNA. Those genes help Tibetans thrive at high altitude and contribute to immunity against new environments, pointing to a lineage we barely understand. Denisovans split from the common ancestor of modern humans and Neanderthals roughly 500 to 600,000 years ago and spread across Asia. Their genetic trail reaches Papua, the Philippines, and the icy Tibetan Plateau, where the inherited DNA still aids breathing thin air. They were not primitive. In the same Denisova cave, archaeologists uncovered a polished green chloritolite bracelet, drilled with such precision that a modern rotary drill would be needed, technology far beyond what one would expect from a Stone Age society. This shows a mind capable of fine craftsmanship, beauty, and purpose. But the Denisovan trace ends in the ground. Their settlements, art, and possible songs have vanished, perhaps dissolved into the earth or carried away by the wind, leaving no obvious record. A similar mystery lies on the volcanic island of Flores in Indonesia. In the year 2003, a cave called Liang Bulu May discovered the remains of a tiny hominin, later nicknamed the Hobbit. Standing just over a meter tall, with a brain the size of a grapefruit, this creature, Homo floresiensis, survived for about 50,000 years, hunting dwarf elephants and using stone tools while the rest of the world changed around it.
How it reached the island is unclear. Ancestors may have sailed, been swept by currents, or crossed now submerged land bridges, illustrating how island evolution can shrink bodies dramatically. Even deeper in time, South Africa's Rising Star cave system revealed a small, climbing-adapted hominin with a tiny brain and curved fingers. The arrangement of the bones indicates deliberate burial, overturning previous assumptions about early human behavior. This man of the caves adds another layer to the puzzle of our complex ancestry. They lived roughly 335 to 230,000 years ago, a time when a brain only a third the size of ours seemed on the brink of vanishing from evolution. Yet they treated their dead with care, deliberately arranging bodies not by accident, a predator's den, or a natural trap, but by intention. What does this mean? A creature with a brain smaller than a modern chimpanzee performed actions we link to symbolic thought, awareness of death, personality, and memory. It's almost unsettling. Fire-using hominins may have been symbolic, but they were not yet creators of myths. Parallel after parallel appear: Denisovans, Neanderthals, hobbits, and other lost lineages flickering in our DNA without leaving abundant bones. Their family tree is not a simple branch, but a braided river of migrations, mergers, extinctions, and memories. Each group possessed intelligence, culture, and its own way of living, circling the edge of something larger, yet never igniting an unstoppable explosion of meaning, until a small corner of Africa 50,000 years ago. Why then? Some argue that isolated groups of Denisovans, Neanderthals, and island dwarfs were too few and scattered for ideas to accumulate. Knowledge flashed and vanished with the death of its carriers. The best tools, hunting strategies, rituals, and songs died in isolation. Others point to a harsh, unpredictable climate that forced survival to trump imagination. When ice moved south, rains ceased, and seas swallowed coastlines, leaving little room for myth.
Perhaps it was sheer chance, a random mix of genes, cultural luck, a child who repeated a story, a symbol that resonated, a ritual that proved effective. Suddenly, the spiral began to turn. Yet a quiet horror lingers. Denisovans almost did it, Neanderthals almost did it, the hobbits almost did it. So why did only one small-brained group spark the fire of culture? Were we inevitable or merely lucky? The fuse was already burning. Traces of ochre, beads, and forgotten migrants whisper of relatives whose faces we will never restore. 50,000 years ago, fire finally flared. But why then and not before? That mystery awaits the next chapter. For decades, the story seemed simple. One origin, one clear line, early Homo sapiens appearing in Africa 300,000 years ago, slowly spreading outward and replacing every other human type. Textbooks, documentaries, and museums presented this staircase, a direct procession to the present. In 2023, however, Nature published a paper titled "Quiet Headline and Non-Speculative Public Lecture, but a Strict Reconstruction of the Deepest Mystery of Human Origin." It offered a confusing riddle not built from bones, but from DNA, a subtle amendment that shatters the old model and rewrites everything. The genome shows that a modern person doesn't descend from a single line, but from two ancient human groups that split more than 1.5 million years ago, early Neanderthals and Denisovans. That split was so deep, it reshapes how we define a species. Around 300,000 years ago, the two lineages began to reconnect, not in a single event, but in waves that stretched over millennia and vast territories. Their intermixing produced us. Instead of a tidy tree, human evolution looks like a braided river. Branches diverge, twist, turn, and later rejoin. The evidence was always near us,
Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, Omo Kibish in Ethiopia, Florisbad in South Africa. Some skulls display familiar modern features. Others retain archaic traits such as unusual brain cases and distinctive jaws. These differences weren't assembled into a single linear sequence because the populations were separate for over 1 million years before mixing again. DNA confirms this deep division, which would have produced distinct species if isolation had continued. Gene flow was weak and slow, preserving differences while keeping the groups compatible when climate, geography, or chance brought them together.
This isn't superficial hybridization where a modern human mates with a Neanderthal and produces a few mixed offspring. It is the fundamental origin of a species with a mixed heritage. Human intelligence didn't arise in a single ecological niche or under one selection pressure. We are the fusion of two ancient survival strategies, one adapted to coastal or forest environments, the other to inland savannas, with differing reliance on hunting, gathering, trapping, or fishing. After more than 1 million years of separate evolution, shifting ice sheets, expanding deserts, and changing river courses removed the barriers, allowing the groups to meet and merge. The resulting modern human form is evident in the scattered fossils, the elongated face of Jebel Irhoud, the rounded cranium of Omo Kibish, the unusual jaw of Florisbad. These are not anomalies, but snapshots of mixing in progress. The model also clarifies the long delay before the cognitive explosion. Early modern bodies existed without the accompanying symbolic culture. Tools of the Middle Stone Age appeared, but art, burials, and complex symbolism emerged only much later, likely because small, isolated populations limited cultural growth. While early human groups lived apart, their knowledge never rose above a ceiling. Innovations appeared, simple fish traps, better skin tanning methods, or basic mortise and tenon tools. But when a drought, disease, or conflict wiped out a tribe, the know-how vanished with it, resetting the culture. This fragile strand was both a biological reality and a cultural trap. Shattered populations could not reliably pass memories forward. Songs dimmed, symbols shifted, and ideas flickered out. Only when a sufficiently large, long-lasting, and dense community emerged could culture begin to snowball. That breakthrough came roughly 60 to 50,000 years ago, when the last of the old barriers fell. People spread along riverbanks and fertile corridors. Trade, marriage, and migration finally wove a stable network. Archaeological records then burst into view. Cave paintings, beads, burials, sculptures, music, and myths. Yet for hundreds of thousands of years before that, the trunk of humanity remained tangled and confused. The parts were ready, but the fire never caught. Another unsettling truth lies beneath the surface. Species boundaries are largely illusionary. Neanderthals and Denisovans were not wholly separate from us. Even the famed Iceman shares more DNA with modern humans than once thought. Fossil lines and genetic data reveal a messy, ladder-like history, not a straight ascent. Populations diverged, adapted, collided, interbred, and erased borders in a perpetual cycle. We were never predestined to be the chosen species. We are the product of accidents, climate shifts, migrations, and countless chance encounters. Change a single drought, river, or coastline, and the whole story could differ. In another timeline, a southern branch might never have mixed, or a disease could have erased a group before it left Africa. Yet the tangled trunk persisted, and the mixture worked. A fragile braid of memory, flesh, and technology pulled humanity forward, even as the clock kept ticking. The chaotic climate machine soon presented a new threat, a supervolcano that pushed the bottleneck to near extinction levels.
Those who survived passed through the narrow funnel that shaped every person alive today, and from the other side, a new spark ignited. One of humanity's strangest facts is that each of us is a hybrid mosaic. Every person of European, Asian, or Indigenous American descent carries about 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA. Residents of Oceania bear another 4 to 6% Denisovan heritage, genes from archaic relatives unknown for most of history, uncovered only after a tiny finger bone and a molar were found in Siberian caves in 2010. A fragment of bone, a tooth, and a genetic signal rewrote everything. That signal has been inside us for thousands of generations. It isn't a footnote to evolution. It's the blood memory of encounters that happened roughly 60 to 40,000 years ago, and perhaps even earlier. These meetings weren't isolated or rare. They occurred often enough that their genetic traces remain in almost all modern people outside sub-Saharan Africa. So a puzzle appears. If early modern humans already had brains the size, capability, and creativity of ours, why did we absorb so much from others? What did we gain and what did we lose? The exchange wasn't just about proximity or chance. It was about survival. Inhaled genes are not random. Many still work today. They shaped our immune system, altered responses to viruses and bacteria, and even changed how our skin reacts to northern sunlight.
Some variants affect blood oxygen levels, most famously the Denisovan genes that let Tibetans thrive at high altitude. Others influence fat storage, metabolism, brain development, susceptibility to depression, nicotine dependence, and daily rhythms. These aren't trivial quirks. They are ancient survival strategies built into us because new environments demanded them. But could there be more? Some researchers argue the mixing wasn't a random byproduct of migration, but a crucial catalyst. Might the cultural explosion that became noticeable about 50,000 years ago have partly depended on the strength of mixed offspring? Before these encounters, Homo sapiens already had bodies, brains, and tools. They hunted, made blades, and used fire. Yet the archaeological record is eerily silent. No cave paintings, no bone flutes, no ritual burials with gifts, no symbols. Then, after the interbreeding over several thousand years, art and ritual appear. People leave Africa in waves, producing necklaces, cave paintings, figurines, and ceremonial burials. Music, stories, and memories emerge, etched onto ochre, carved into tusks, painted on limestone. Is this coincidence? Some say yes. They point to the numbers. When enough people gathered in resource-rich places like the South African coast or the Levant, population density allowed culture to flourish. Ideas stopped dying with their inventors. Language grew more complex. Myths took root, and memory externalized. Others think hybrids were key. The influx of Neanderthal, Denisovan, and perhaps unknown ghost populations could have selectively reshaped the Homo sapiens brain. Indeed, certain Neanderthal-derived genes influence nervous system development, hinting that the genetic legacy of these ancient meetings helped spark the cultural leap that defines us today. Separate Denisovan sites hint at how neural connections formed. One hypothesis claims that Neanderthal DNA altered dopamine regulation, reshaping reward circuits, motivation, and creativity. Another view suggests the genetic mix affected daily hormone rhythms, sleep-wake cycles, and perhaps a propensity for altered states of consciousness linked to trance, music, and ancient spiritual practices. Did early modern humans need that precise blend?
We still don't know, but the pattern is striking. Homo sapiens possessed the full range of mental abilities long before the so-called cultural explosion.
The pieces were in place, yet nothing ignited during prolonged droughts, glacial periods, or after the technological advances of the Middle Stone Age. Then, roughly between 55 and 45,000 years ago, a rapid transformation occurred. The archaic genes in our blood were not silent bystanders. They acted as neighbors, rivals, partners, sometimes foes, sometimes allies, and perhaps as mirrors that forced us to confront ourselves. A disturbing symmetry emerges. Modern humans entered Europe, and within 10,000 years, Neanderthals vanished. They reached the Denisovan lands of Siberia, and the Denisovans disappeared as well. Each time Homo sapiens arrived, the other hominins faded, yet their legacy lives inside us. The paradox is that the very lineages whose extinction made us the last people also helped shape who we are. Even with hybrid offspring, borrowed immunity, and neural quirks, the mental surge did not happen immediately, nor everywhere. Early ornaments, ochre engravings, and buried bones are rare, localized, and fragile. So why did a full cultural fire blaze only 50,000 years ago? What were our ancestors waiting for? If we could rewind the planet for the past 100,000 years, we would witness a dramatic landscape. Lower sea levels during the last ice age exposed vast continental shelves, turning coastlines into expansive plains. The Persian Gulf became a lush basin, the English Channel disappeared, and a land bridge linked Southeast Asia into a single supercontinent. Along Africa, Asia, and beyond, a strip of land stretched hundreds of kilometers between present-day Australia and the Americas, now submerged. These exposed coasts offered abundant food, fish, shellfish, seabirds, river estuaries, shelter in rocks, flat campsites, predictable tides, warm winds, and open horizons. For mobile hunter-gatherers and the first sedentary communities, they were a paradise now lost. When glaciers melted, sea level rose about 120 meters, flooding the shelves. The inundated area is estimated at roughly 20 million square kilometers, an expanse comparable to North America. This isn't just a matter of geography. Every time we wonder why the earliest coastal settlements are so few and why the archaeological record is ragged, we overlook the simplest answer. They lie beneath the sea. The idea isn't wild. It follows inevitably from the rise in sea level after the last glacial maximum. As the Ice Age peaked, coastlines shifted worldwide, and people habitually gathered along those shores. From roughly 130,000 to 10,000 years ago, during the late Pleistocene, sea levels rose dramatically, pushing the most fertile lands and richest food sources away from today's beaches and into areas now underwater. A handful of findings support this picture. Flooded shelves off Australia contain traces of ancient activity. The submerged Doggerland beneath the British Isles holds stone tools, animal bones, and settlement remnants. Sonar surveys of the continental shelf between present-day Indonesia and Malaysia reveal former river channels, lake basins, and elevated platforms ideal for camps. Similar paleocoastal landscapes have been identified in the Persian Gulf, the Adriatic, and the Bering Sea. Yet underwater archaeology remains extremely challenging. Salt water corrodes bone and wood far faster than dry caves. Currents disturb sites, and sediments constantly shift. Only a few seabed excavations have been carried out, mostly for military or oil exploration purposes, not for archaeology. Consequently,
The oft-quoted claim that there is no evidence of human occupation older than 50,000 years merely reflects our focus on dry land that never sank, not the absence of such settlements. This raises a stark question. Have entire chapters of human history vanished because we are digging in the wrong places? Modern Homo sapiens first appear in Africa 300 to 200,000 years ago, equipped with blades, fire, adhesives, and composite tools, yet leaving little cultural trace, no widespread symbolic art, no large structures. Then, between 70 and 50,000 years ago, a dramatic shift occurs. Symbolic culture blossoms, and people spread to Australia, Europe, and beyond. Could there have been whole phases of coastal experimentation, building, gathering, storytelling, that left no trace because the ocean swallowed them? The pattern is puzzling. The earliest confirmed sites in the Levant, South Africa, and the Australian coasts already display sophisticated marine adaptations. Fishing spears, deep-sea shell collection, and intertidal mining. Those skills differ markedly from savanna hunting, suggesting generations of ocean edge exploration. Moreover, Middle Stone Age toolkits, microliths, composite spears, bone implements appear in the record almost fully formed, as if they were invented elsewhere and then imported. Where were the workshops that produced them, and how many now lie beneath the waves? The mystery extends to the migration to Australia, a journey that may have left its most telling evidence on now submerged coastlines. Even the most modest sea route from Southeast Asia to Australia required crossing an open stretch of water, 70 to 100 kilometers, with no land in sight. This wasn't a chance rescue on a floating log. It demanded deliberate navigation, boat design, and shipbuilding. Yet the very shipyards that produced those vessels vanished beneath the waves, a mystery echoed in Japan, the Philippines, and the Mediterranean islands. People had to master seamanship long before any terrestrial archaeological sites appear, suggesting that the seeds of agriculture may also be tied to lost coastlines. Some scholars argue that the first experiments with plant cultivation didn't begin in river valleys like the Nile or the Tigris-Indus, but on now submerged shores where communities gathered wild grains, mollusks, and tubers. When rising seas drowned those early fields, the survivors carried their knowledge inland, sparking the later Neolithic revolutions. The same pattern repeats throughout the Holocene. In the last 10,000 years, floods erased entire settlements. The Black Sea inundation about 7,000 years ago could have swallowed whole towns. Sea level rise in Southeast Asia erased vast human habitats, and rising waters along the Pacific and Atlantic coasts of the Americas left almost no indigenous trace. Consequently, the archaeological record is skewed toward elevated interior sites, places that were not necessarily the most favorable before historic times, while the real action unfolded on lands now submerged. This creates a puzzling gap. Homo sapiens possessed brains, tools, and fire, yet we have little mythic or memory evidence from that era. Perhaps we're asking the wrong question. Coastal groups may have hosted thriving cultures with music, rock art, and carved stones now lying 60 meters underwater. Cemeteries, sanctuaries, and stories could have persisted for 20,000 years before being drowned, leaving only faint echoes in later populations. When the ice melted and seas swallowed the coasts, people fled inland and collective memory faded. The cultural explosion around 50,000 years ago might therefore represent a restart rather than an origin. The earliest symbolic objects, beads, engraved ochre, polished shells, are disproportionately found near ancient coastlines and the edges of now flooded shelves. We still lack definitive answers. Only the newest seabed exploration tools, laser scanners, bottom mapping sonar, subsurface profiling, and autonomous robots promise to reveal the hidden maps of human history. For now, the ocean guards its secrets, and the question remains, how much of our past lies beneath the waves? And why did fire, once extinguished by flood, rekindle only 50,000 years ago? There is a grim truth about archaeology and time. Almost everything vanishes quickly. Whether a person builds a simple hut, a wooden boat, a woven village, a ritual circle, or a collection of songs passed by voice, time erases it, leaving no trace. Archaeology, despite its romantic image of tombs and treasures, studies only what survives. Stone lasts, bone sometimes, fired clay can endure, and metal may persist depending on its alloy and corrosion. Wood, fiber, leather, hair, fur, reed mats, wicker baskets, ropes, sails, nets, furniture, drums, wooden idols, canoes, oars, thatched roofs, scaffolding, beds, shoes, cloth, fences, fishing traps, sleds, backpacks, musical instruments, and tools all disappear. In open air, water and microbes can destroy them in a few decades. Even the intangible side of culture, stories, myths, language, songs, memories, rituals, marriage rules, laws, superstitions, dreams, exists only in voice and gesture and disappears when the last speaker dies. If 99% of a society's material and immaterial heritage is perishable, a few thousand years of rain, wind, fungi, insects, earthquakes, floods, fire, sea level rise, and river changes will wipe it out. Wooden posts rot, wicker mats decompose, bones are scattered or dissolved. The entire cultural record could vanish the moment the final keeper of knowledge dies. Thus, the few objects we have from ancient times are miracles. They survived in exceptional conditions: sealed caves, dry deserts, oxygen-free swamps, layers of volcanic ash, or similar rare circumstances. Otherwise, the world continually resets and forgets. This is not a hypothesis, but an observed fact. Even after only a few thousand years, most wooden ships have disappeared. Only a handful survive as fragments, like Viking longships, Egyptian reed boats, or Polynesian canoes, often recovered from oxygen-depleted water. Going back 50,000 or 100,000 years, the odds of any organic artifact surviving approach zero. Consequently, the overwhelming majority of tools we uncover are stone, not because stone was the dominant material, but because stone endures. The cruel implication is clear. If early humans built semi-permanent settlements, erected fish barriers, wove fabrics, or raised wooden ritual circles, we will probably never know about them. Almost nothing would have survived. The signs of humanity we do have, cave paintings, figurines, carved symbols, are the few pieces that escaped the ravages of time. Stone art endures. Art on wood, leather, sand, or song does not. This creates a blind spot in our reconstruction of the past that archaeologists call negative testimony. When nothing is found, does it mean the practice never existed, or simply that it left no trace? Consider the interval from roughly 300 to 50,000 years ago, often called the time-lapse period. We ask where the symbolic culture, monuments, graves, art has gone. Yet the planet itself has repeatedly reset large swathes of its surface. Rising seas drowned about 20 million kilometers of coastline, erasing not only rotted material, but also everything that sank. Regions such as the Zanclean Shelf, Doggerland, the Persian Gulf, Beringia, and the Sahul Shelf between Australia and New Guinea were once densely populated, fertile, and stable, but they have vanished. Nevertheless, the record is not empty. Ochre mines in South Africa, engraved Indonesian shells, and Moroccan beads demonstrate that symbolic behavior did appear and occasionally broke through to the surface. The scarcity of such finds does not prove the rarity of the behavior. Perhaps 99% of the cultural canvas has simply been wiped away. This raises a crucial question. Did our ancestors become symbolic thinkers only relatively recently? Or had they been creating myths, telling stories, and performing rituals for far longer, only to have their work erased by natural entropy? Imagine a culture built mainly from perishable materials: straw villages, bone tools, shells, fibers, log boats, and vines. Communities mastering tides, currents, and seasonal migrations. Circles around fires where knowledge lived in songs, dances, and memorized genealogies. Such patterns persist in living oral traditions among groups like the San, Australian Aboriginal peoples, and Polynesian navigators, whose astronomical, ecological, and spiritual knowledge is transmitted entirely by voice and ritual. If all those societies disappeared, villages empty, bodies unburied, lands flooded, archaeological traces would be almost nil. Perhaps a few stone tools, hearths, and bones, if we were lucky. The same may hold true for our own ancestors. Thus, the spark 50,000 years ago may not represent a sudden birth of culture, but rather a moment when conditions finally allowed an existing symbolic tradition to expand, survive, and spread from one group to another, from shore to inland, and from continent to continent. The chronicle only flashes when the survivors finally seize the erasing machine, leaving us to wonder what humanity truly changed as it neared myth-making. The fire of knowledge is already gathering and will blaze in the next chapter. Truth about learning isn't housed in individual brains, but in networks, groups, and communities. When a network is too small, fragmented, or unstable, its knowledge vanishes, no matter how brilliant any single person may be. Being alone among 20, 100, or even a few thousand people isn't enough. The laws of scale are unforgiving, a cold mathematics of cultural drift. Throughout most of history, intelligent humans lived in bands of 20 to 50, occasionally reaching 100 in fertile areas. On an entire continent like Africa, only dozens of thousands existed, scattered across deserts, mountains, and hostile lands. At such low densities, everything is fragile. New inventions, a weapon, a fishing net, a musical instrument, or a fire-making technique die if they don't spread, disappearing within a generation. This isn't speculation, it's mathematical reality. In small populations, knowledge is forgotten faster than it's created. Languages fragment, myths crumble, skills vanish, and techniques are reinvented only to be lost again. Consider the Tasmanian Aboriginals, isolated for millennia after rising seas cut Tasmania off from Australia about 10,000 years ago. Complex mainland technologies, fishing tools, bone needles, fire-making methods
disappeared not because people grew less intelligent, but because the minimum group size required to retain them was unmet. Random loss outweighed innovation. Apply this pattern globally between 120,000 and 60,000 years ago. Vast, harsh landscapes, advancing ice, expanding deserts, and shifting coastlines isolated groups, leaving no sustainable trade routes or large migration networks, only family clusters reliant on memory and a chain of knowledge keepers. People discovered plant processing, navigation, fishing, and composite tools using wood, resin, ochre, and fat. Yet any disruption, drought, predator, loss of elders, disease, or a river changing course could erase a skill forever. This perpetual tug between memory and oblivion explains the patchy archaeological record. Bursts of symbolic behavior, ochre processing at Pinkle Point, alcohol production at Blombos appear and then vanish for tens of thousands of years. Complex tools emerge in one layer and disappear in the next. Bone artifacts appear in Central Africa around 90,000 years ago, only to fade as if never existing. There was no wide spread of ideas, only tiny local experiments that often vanished after a generation or two. It wasn't ignorance that stopped them. It was simply too few people. Culture needs density. More people mean more ideas, more chances to record them, and more backup when someone forgets. If one storyteller dies, 3 others can keep the song alive. If one master loses a skill, another can teach it again. Networks of people smooth out loss and let knowledge survive disasters. But 50,000 years ago, humanity hadn't yet reached the numbers needed for such stability. The climate was erratic. Between 120,000 and 60,000 years ago, the planet swung between warm interglacials and sudden droughts, with forests expanding, deserts appearing, seas rising and retreating. Each shift caused populations to boom, collapse, and rise again. Coastal zones offered the most reliable resources, mollusks, algae, tidal pools, when inland deserts turned hostile. Yet those coastlines were short-lived. Later ice ages drowned them, erasing whole archives beneath hundreds of meters of water. Even then, the global population was minuscule, perhaps 20,000 individuals at peak, and for long stretches only 10,000 across the entire world. It's a miracle that any cultural traces survived. The same dynamics appear today. Languages spoken by fewer than 1,000 people are highly vulnerable. A single epidemic, migration, or famine can break the chain of memory. Memory is everything, and its fragility explains the mathematics of failure in cultural transmission. For millennia, humanity had curiosity, language, and imagination, but not enough numbers to preserve them. A long period of climate stability finally allowed populations to become denser, more connected, and longer lasting. The memory chain lengthened, stopped tearing, and knowledge began to accumulate in layers. One innovation sparked the next. Fire-hardened weapons led to new tools, clothing, art, myths, and the symbolic world we live in. The real cultural explosion happened about 50,000 years ago, not because humans suddenly became smarter, but because population crossed a critical threshold. After that, the laws of scale flipped. Culture stopped dying faster than it spread and started to snowball. Before that, from 120,000 to 60,000 years ago, seeds were planted and sparks flickered, but the fire never caught. Only when enough people gathered could the exponential growth of ideas finally take off.
1 person can survive alone, 10 can make a group, and 50 can share stories. When the invisible borders of reality shift, knowledge stops being a flickering flame and becomes an unquenchable fire. A threshold effect that explains why 200,000 years can feel uneventful, and then suddenly, everything changes. The same regularity appears in every network, from neurons to cities, ecosystems to trade routes. A fragile, sparse network eventually becomes dense, sustainable, and richly connected. So information no longer dies out quickly. A network of 2 users is useless, but a network of 2 billion can reshape the world. Early humans might have carved symbols on ochre, yet after 10 generations the technique could be lost, showing how little changed. Genetic models suggest that from 300 to 80,000 years ago, the total human population was fewer than the residents of many modern suburbs, often around 20,000, sometimes dropping below 100,000 reproducing individuals. Across the planet, they lived in family groups of 20 to 30, separated by deserts, forests, and mountains. Each group was a fragile island of memory, a grandmother's song, a hunter's glue recipe, a shaman's star knowledge. The death of a key person, a drought, or an attack could erase an entire cultural cachet. Anthropologists James Powell, Stephen Shannon, and Mark Thomas identified this pattern. They concluded that in small populations, cultural complexity collapses. Random loss erases innovation faster than it can accumulate. It isn't a question of intelligence, merely of numbers. As population density rises, the mathematics flips. Enough people are linked often enough that knowledge ceases to be fragile. Redundant memory becomes the foundation of civilization. Archaeology marks a turning point between 80 and 60,000 years ago. After a series of glaciations, the climate stabilized and coasts rich in fish and shellfish began to attract groups. Genetic evidence shows accelerated growth, new migration corridors, and mixing of previously isolated groups, swapping genes and ideas. Complex tools, decorated shells, beads, and ochre processing sites persist across generations. Funerary customs show continuity rather than isolated experiments. Though not yet a full explosion, the curve began to bend 50,000 years ago, and humanity's relationship to knowledge turned cumulative. Now, cultures copy and improve rather than merely repeat. History survives, accumulates detail, and weaves rituals into a shared fabric that links generations. Fishing, body paint, and art no longer vanish with a single village. They spread, evolve, and multiply. Between 80 and 60,000 years ago, African expansions no longer hit dead ends. Groups were large enough to preserve memory, turning cultural transmission from a single candle into a forest fire. It wasn't that everyone suddenly began painting caves or carving figures and instantly shared their knowledge. What changed was the balance of human societies. Instead of losing information, Homo sapiens started accumulating it, and that shift explains the rapid jump in history. There was no long silence caused by a lack of imagination. The numbers of cultural artifacts simply stayed very low until a threshold was crossed that could never be undone. From that point, the curve rose, and an explosion of innovation followed. Some moments in our past are so astounding they seem impossible, yet they happened.
Long before the wheel, writing, metalworking, agriculture, or cities, barefoot hunter-gatherers took the boldest step ever imagined. They stared at an endless ocean and decided to cross it. This is the story of how Homo sapiens reached Australia. Roughly 65,000 years ago, people stood on what are now the Indonesian islands. Sea levels were over 100 meters lower, and most of Southeast Asia formed a single landmass known to archaeologists as Sunda. Australia, however, was never linked to this continent by a land bridge. The combined region of modern Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania, called Sahul, remained separated by deep, treacherous straits. No footpath ever existed, so crossing required boats. The shortest crossing spanned at least 70 kilometers of open water, and in places it exceeded 100 kilometers. The seas were deep, with strong currents, tides, and frequent storms, one of the most daring feats ever attempted by a living creature. Yet people did it. We know this not only from bones and tools, but from the very presence of Homo sapiens across the continent. By 65,000 years ago, humans were already spread worldwide, confronting a hostile landscape populated by giant marsupial predators, massive wombats, flightless birds taller than ostriches, and huge reptiles. Despite these dangers, they thrived. Archaeological sites such as the Majobe Bebe rock shelter in northern Australia contain artifacts dated between 59 and 50,000 years ago. Ground stone axes, ochre fragments, and grain grinding stones. These finds are not the debris of accidental shipwrecks. They belong to people who arrived deliberately and stayed. No boats, ropes, or sails have survived the tropical climate for 60,000 years. But the absence of a land bridge and the impossibility of a natural animal migration make accidental arrival implausible. Simulations show that a drifting vessel has almost no chance of reaching Sahul. Success would have required multiple vessels launched together, a chosen direction, coordinated action, and a belief that the empty horizon could be crossed. In other words, the voyage was intentional, marking the moment when these early peoples passed a mental threshold and set out for a new world. They imagined, planned, and gave shape to goals they could not see. To cross open water, they fashioned bamboo rafts, hollowed canoes, or reed boats sealed with resin. We do not know the exact designs, but we can infer the minds that created them. Building a vessel required knowledge of materials, how to join frames, seal cracks, and read tides and winds, collective memory passed down through myth. Someone must have pointed beyond the horizon, spoken of land on the far side, and set the story in motion. Archaeology shows that the settlement of Sakale happened quickly. Tens of thousands of years ago, Homo sapiens moved from desert edges to rivers and forests, reshaping local megafauna and causing many large species to disappear. From there, they spread to New Guinea, Tasmania, and later, 3,000 years ago, Polynesian sailors pushed the limits, sailing across the whole hemisphere to reach Hawaii, Easter Island, and New Zealand. The transition to Sakale is a clear sign that as early as 65,000 years ago, the human brain operated with a modern, collective mindset. Long before the great European cave art explosion, lion-headed figurines, early music, agriculture, monuments, cities, and writing. People could cross oceans, yet for thousands of years they left no permanent structures, a paradox of a ready mind and a dormant symbolic fire. To cross a water expanse where no shore is visible, they first built an invisible map of language, imagination, and story. They pictured an empty horizon, no birds, no smoke, just endless water. Leaving required trust in what could not be seen, not instinct or animal migration, but pure abstraction. The ability to picture reality differently from what was directly visible.
By this time, Homo sapiens had crafted mental maps of space, distance, direction, and probability and shared them. No one could make such a voyage alone. They trained, debated, and agreed. One suggested the direction of land, another recalled birds that had flown that way weeks before, a third noted the lunar tides, another knew how to cut reeds, tie knots, and seal seams, while someone else calculated food supplies and chose the departure moment. Nothing was written down. Everything lived in memory, song, and oral tradition. Myth arose not as falsehood, but as a story that held more truth than mere data. Beyond the horizon lies a place no one has reached, a mental space neuroscientists call symbolic thinking, the capacity to replace one idea with another. This ability lets the mind picture gods, laws, histories, or any invisible concept and treat it as real. It isn't just individual, it's collective.
No single person holds the whole map, so we live in groups, each contributing a piece. Cognitive archaeology calls this cumulative culture, the engine that drives humanity and that no other animal fully masters. A chimp learns by watching. A crow bends a wire into a hook, yet that knowledge dies with the individual, forcing each generation to start over. Humans, however, teach and tell stories, letting each new generation begin from the edge of prior knowledge. Crossing a 100-kilometer ocean, for example, requires a narrative that says, "It can be done." The boat, our first shadow of distant technology, combines wood, fibers, and buoyancy into a vessel that survives the waves. The same mental architecture later builds bridges, temples, cities, and telescopes. A brain that learns to swim will one day learn to fly. Early sailors had no farms, monuments, writing, or permanent settlements. Their homes were branches and skins, their burials simple, their walls undecorated. Reason had appeared, but the world it could create was still unborn. A small band might cross an ocean, but a city demands hundreds or thousands of people, surplus food, power, trade, and stable ecological and social conditions, none of which existed 65,000 years ago. Around 50,000 years ago, the curve tipped. Archaeology suddenly bursts with bone flutes, cave paintings, figurines, decorated burials, and pigments. Culture didn't evolve slowly. It exploded almost everywhere at once, as if a mirror of the past were shattered. This worldwide surge marks the moment memory became visible. In a southern French limestone cave, a hand spreads red ochre on a wall, and nearby someone mixes black manganese powder with fat. In the flickering firelight of Chauvet Cave, ancient artists painted a lion with its mouth open, horses with flowing manes, antelopes whose hooves seemed to strike stone, and other creatures with startling anatomical detail. These are not mere decorations. They are vivid memories of animals, their spirits, and an imagined presence of the absent. Chauvet is at least 46,000 years old. When radiocarbon dating finally arrived at the end of the 20th century, it showed that the cave's art predates any known fire-making tradition. Thousands of miles away on the Indonesian island of Sulawesi, a hand was pressed into a wall and pigment sprayed around it. Calcite that grew over the paint was dated to 45,000 years, a ghostly handprint that shocked scholars. Adjacent to it, a babirusa, an unusual pig-like animal, is rendered with lines and curves worthy of any museum. Further north, Spain's El Castillo cave contains red dots and smears, some arranged like constellations that are at least 40,000 years old. Across 3 continents, separated by tens of thousands of kilometers,
early peoples produced remarkably similar images and used the same techniques. Modern humans had roamed the earth for 200,000 years, hunting, making tools, mastering fire, and occasionally etching simple patterns on ochre. Yet nothing resembled the sophisticated scenes of Chauvet, Sulawesi, or El Castillo. Around 50,000 years ago, a breakthrough occurred. Not a literal switch, but a cultural fracture that let ideas spread, populations grow, and knowledge be reliably passed on. Language became precise enough to describe not only objects, but also their spirits, histories, and powers. Reason turned into myth. Cave art therefore transcended simple animal catalogs. It served ritual and magical purposes, an attempt to manage survival forces, honor hunters, and invoke or appease the unseen. Artists entered the dark stone womb, drawing what they sought, feared, and imagined. Handprints, created by spraying pigment around a pressed palm, acted as signatures or spells. "I was here," "Remember me," or "This place is mine." These practices were not confined to Europe or Indonesia. In Namibia, the Apollo 11 cave holds some of Africa's oldest painted slabs. Australian rock shelters display kangaroos, emus, and geometric motifs that may predate earlier estimates. In the Kimberley region, figures with glowing headdresses and elongated limbs reveal a visual language transmitted across thousands of generations. Across all sites, the same toolkit appears: pigments, patterned motifs, carved objects, beads strung into necklaces, bone needles, and shells carried hundreds of kilometers inland. Symbols of exchange, value, and meaning. Each image is accompanied by the sound of its creation, echoing through deep time. The oldest musical instruments we know are flutes carved from bird bones and mammoth tusk, dating to around 40,000 years ago. Caves were not silent chambers. While people painted lines on the walls, someone would play and sing, and the stone seemed to answer with images, sounds, and memory.
That moment marked the shift from pure survival to the birth of symbolic culture. Archaeologists link this shift to several factors: growing populations, stable climates, expanding social networks, more complex language, and a critical mass of shared knowledge. Neuroscientists add that the human brain began mastering recursion, the ability to nest one story inside another, to imagine other minds, and to picture possibilities beyond the present. This recursive mind gave rise to abstraction, allowing us to invent gods, laws, and futures, and to wonder about the meaning of a simple red dot on a wall. Across continents, France, Indonesia, Spain, Africa, Australia, early people drew similar symbols: hands, animals, bars, spirals, dots, and lines. These marks survived tens of thousands of years, outlasting extinctions, migrations, and empires. A cave wall became a kind of cathedral, a canvas, a pact with the future. To leave a mark was to declare, "I belong to something larger than myself." That declaration drew a line between the animal mind and the symbolic one, between raw survival and the memory of one's own life. The world kept changing. As some caves burned, humanity transformed. Hunters turned into researchers, explorers, settlers, and storytellers. The story began not with a shout, but with a whisper of bone, ochre, and song. 50,000 years ago, archaeological records show that wherever intelligent humans lived, a new behavior appeared almost simultaneously. Tiny holes were drilled into snail shells, beads were strung into necklaces, bodies were laid in graves and covered with red ochre, sometimes with weapons or carved figures nearby. In dark caves, people cut, drew, and sculpted meaning on walls that had known only wind and silence. That moment broke the timeline. More people walked the earth, yet traces of symbolic thought remained scarce. Survival tools, spears and fire, were common, but symbols, myths, and music were rare. Then, meaning erupted. In present-day France, Spain, and Germany, Homo sapiens, and perhaps the last Neanderthals, crafted the oldest known musical instruments. Vulture bone flutes from the Hohlfels cave in Germany date to about 43 to 44,000 years ago. Music existed long before cities, writing, agriculture, kings, or priests. First came the melody. The breath that passed through hollow bones made both air and spirit tremble.
Thousands of objects, carved from tusk, bone, shells, even mammoth ivory, have been found beside buzzing instruments in caves, open sites, and graves. Hand-drilled and polished, they required many hours of work. They weren't tools for hunting or gathering. They were expressions of identity, status, adornment, perhaps even prayer. Soon, burials became common, their walls painted with ochre. In Sumgir, Russia, a site dating to about 34,000 years ago reveals two children buried face to face, their bodies covered with more than 10,000 tiny tusk beads sewn onto clothing. No practical benefit came from this effort. The children could no longer hunt or provide food, yet the community spent weeks, perhaps months, crafting their burial attire. It was not about survival, it was about meaning. Red ochre, mixed with pigment, was used to coat the bones of the dead. This practice appears across Africa, Europe, and Southeast Asia. Scholars debate its symbolism: life, death, earth, the sacred, or simply tradition repeated because ancestors did it. Tradition turns memory into ritual, and ritual forms culture. Music, beads, burial rites, and pigment all emerge in the same narrow time span as the first cave drawings, a coincidence that signals a shift in thinking. Researchers call this the rise of recursive cognition, the ability to represent abstractions nested within other abstractions. It's the move from depicting a deer to thinking about the idea of a deer, from portraying a friend to recalling a memory of that friend, from showing an object to using it as a symbol for something else. This is the foundation of mythic storytelling. In Sulawesi caves, hand-stamped pigment images of wild pigs over 45,000 years old predate most famous European paintings. Pressing a palm to stone and blowing pigment around it was a statement, a ghostly signature declaring, "I was here, I mattered." Similar red circles appear in El Costal, Spain, and handprints in Chauvet, France, where lions, rhinos, and mammoths are rendered in motion, with attention to muscles and breath, more vision than doodle. Art was not only visual. Bone flutes created whole sound worlds. Beads signified clothing, personality, burial, memory. Together, these artifacts reveal a mind aware of its mortality and place in the universe. Whether this marks an endpoint or a spark, from this moment onward, everything accelerated. Breath turned into language, memory into genealogy, music into ceremony. A modest ochre-covered burial would, over tens of thousands of years, evolve into pyramids, cathedrals, and even space probes. Yet a lingering question remains. If the Homo sapiens brain structure and genetic toolkit existed for hundreds of thousands of years, why did the cultural explosion happen only around 34,000 years ago, and not 200 or 300,000 years earlier? The archaeological record offers a puzzling clue. Even after the symbolic mind awakens, art, music, myth, change doesn't spread everywhere. Whole regions lag behind, And the shift isn't a single switch for everyone. Ideas passed hand to hand like fire, sometimes flickering out. The real question after that awakening isn't whether people can create meaning, but what they choose to do with it. For more than 250,000 years, anatomically modern humans roamed the world with brains as large and complex as ours. They crafted spears, shaped stone, mastered fire, and likely mourned their dead. Yet they left no cave paintings, no carved deities, no music, no mythology, no intricate social contracts. Their lives seemed separate from the symbolic realm. Around 50,000 years ago, something hidden in the mind's folds flipped a switch. People suddenly began scattering symbols everywhere. Burials were laced with ochre and ornaments. Beads, pendants, and tattoos marked personal identity. Musical instruments appeared, and cave walls from France to distant lands filled with ghostly hands, shining animals, and fiery night scenes. Anthropology's most stubborn question is simple yet painful. Why then? Why not 100,000 years ago, when humans had already left Africa? Why not 200,000 years ago, when our species formed in the sands of Morocco? Why not 30 or 40,000 years later, when all the necessary components were already scattered across the planet? The unsettling answer: was this shift inevitable or a stroke of luck? For decades, genetics offered a tidy hypothesis. A mutation around 70 to 50,000 years ago rewired existing brain connections without creating new structures. The prime suspect was the FOXP2 gene, discovered in the late 1990s while studying a family with severe speech impairments. Mutations in this gene impair grammar, speech coordination, and the fine motor skills needed for pronunciation, leading scientists to propose it as a trigger. Initially, the data seemed convincing. FOX2 regulates dozens of other genes involved in brain development, especially the basal ganglia and motor control, and it is crucial for mastering sequences, from linking syllables to building grammatical rules. A timely mutation might have lifted working memory limits, turning simple sounds into complex language, and language into culture. Then the picture changed. In 2007, Svante Pääbo's team found the same FOX2 version in Neanderthal DNA. Neanderthals possessed it, meaning the gene's role wasn't unique to Homo sapiens. The gene had existed for at least 100,000 years before the symbolic explosion, perhaps even longer. This didn't discard the genetic view, but complicated it. Researchers now favor polygenic models, a cascade of small genetic tweaks, each nudging cognition, memory, or speech coordination. Candidate genes affect neuronal connection plasticity, dopamine pathways, and working memory. Yet no single decisive gene has been identified. Genetics alone can't explain humanity's leap. The surrounding world mattered too. In the late Pleistocene, our ancestors wrestled with a hostile planet. Between 180,000 and 120,000 years ago, Africa swung wildly from severe droughts to lush green corridors, and repeated genetic bottlenecks thinned the population. Then, about 74,000 years ago, the Toba super-eruption blanketed the sky with ash, likely triggering a volcanic winter that pushed early modern humans to the brink of extinction. From that perspective, the burst of symbolic behavior that followed wasn't sparked by a new mutation, but by environmental stability. Around 60,000 years ago, the climate steadied. Riverbanks along the African continent became reliably wet. Food sources grew more dependable, and populations expanded. Groups met more often, and culture began to act like a network effect. Imagine a brilliant individual who invents a better fishing hook or tells a story about the moon. If he dies before passing it on, the invention vanishes. When populations are tiny, such cultural drives die out faster than they spread. Once a critical density is reached, knowledge spreads faster than it is lost. Children learning from elders transmit not only survival skills, but also songs, myths, and beliefs. In 2009, Paula and Thomas formalized this idea with evolutionary biology models, showing that once a community reaches a few hundred to a few thousand connected people, innovations snowball. More minds mean more tweaks, peer feedback, and opportunities to refine ideas. The pattern isn't a smooth curve, but a sudden fracture, matching the archaeological record. Before 60,000 years ago, symbolic acts appear in isolated bursts, engraved ochre, beads, occasional fire, without a global spread. After that point, symbolic behavior pops up across continents, cultures, and climates. The puzzle remains. If sheer numbers drive cultural complexity, why did the threshold cross only then? Humans had reached the Middle East 100,000 years ago, and perhaps even China earlier. Yet those groups were still too small or lacked other conditions. Some scholars argue that a rare coincidence of trade routes, rich environments, and social density finally aligned, making the explosion a random spark rather than an inevitability. Others contend that culture accumulates over generations. The first hunter who painted a spear couldn't grasp art, but his great-grandchildren could. The first scratch on ochre might have been meaningless, yet successive generations built meaning onto it. Thus, the Great Leap 50,000 years ago wasn't a miracle, but the culmination of countless tiny experiments, gradual skill layering, and the eventual breaking of a cultural dam. The truth may be even more unsettling. There might not be a single cause behind the symbolic explosion that marked humanity's leap. It could be a classic case of a new property emerging from a complex system, just as consciousness arises from countless neurons, or an ant colony organizes without a leader. Meaning may have sprung from countless small factors: genes, climate, demography, memory, pure chance, none sufficient on its own. Around 50,000 years ago, something irreversible and abrupt occurred, a shift archaeologists call the Great Divide. After a long, almost flat curve spanning hundreds of thousands of years, the archaeological record suddenly bursts with art, jewelry, music, tools, burials, bone needles, fishhooks, ritual ochre, beads, carvings, and unmistakable signs of narrative. Not full language yet, but symbols, patterns, and memory transferred onto objects. This surge happened not in a single spot, but worldwide. From the limestone caves of France to the volcanic walls of Sulawesi, from South Africa's red ochre sands to Australia's coastal rocks, almost simultaneously, as if the planet inhaled and exhaled meaning. Why then, and not earlier? Why not at sites like Blombos, where ochre engravings and shell beads appear 140,000 years ago, or at the modern humans roaming Ethiopia 200,000 years ago, or even earlier hominins with fire and wooden tools? The answer isn't a single gene, invention, or shaman. It was a complex coincidence. The right fire meeting the right fuel at the right moment. Genes played a part. The public once focused on FOXP2, dubbed the language gene, after a British family's speech-impairing mutation. By 2007, it was clear Neanderthals shared the same FOXP2 variant, and later research showed this gene merely regulates a small gear of a vast nervous system mechanism involving motor control and vocal learning, necessary but not sufficient for meaning. The crucial factor was the overall neural architecture, especially the frontal cortex that supports planning, imagination, and impulse inhibition. By 50,000 years ago, these genetic variants are widespread, inherited from both modern human and Neanderthal Denisovan ancestry. Yet a genome alone is only potential. Cultural complexity needs a sizable population. Powell, Shannon, and Thomas demonstrated in 2009 that sophisticated culture cannot persist in tiny groups. Innovations die faster than they spread. The bow's inventor cannot keep his invention alive if he dies before passing it on. In a world where oral tradition is the only backup, knowledge is fragile. Up to 60,000 years ago, Homo sapiens lived at extremely low densities, sometimes fewer than 10,000 breeding individuals across thousands of square kilometers. A single drought could erase a whole generation's lore. A failed migration could wipe out a technology. Then the climate began to steady after a tumultuous sixth sea phase. Rivers found steady banks, rain cycles evened out across Africa, the Levant, and Southeast Asia. Populations grew, networks expanded, and ideas could be sustained. A song could be taught to children with the expectation that it would reach their grandchildren. But the shift was more than demographic. The way humans thought transformed, a change anthropologists call cognitive modernity. Beyond tools, fire, and hunting strategies, people developed recursive thinking, symbolic abstraction, and the capacity to reflect on their own thoughts, to imagine the non-existent, and to create gods, ancestors, and futures. This leap turned a memory of a river lion into a myth of a lion spirit that could both rage and protect. Myths, law, morality, and society are built on symbols. Yet symbols alone are insufficient. They need physical carriers, beads, ochre, carvings, signs that externalize memory. Neuroscientists describe this as projecting thought outward, turning fleeting neural activity into stable material records. A song etched into rock, a family lineage encoded in bead patterns, a map kept in drum rhythms. Chance also plays a decisive role. No deterministic law guarantees survival. Genetic bottlenecks, such as the Toba eruption around 74,000 years ago, nearly erased humanity. Repeated climate swings repeatedly drove populations to the brink of extinction. A slightly colder ice age, a drier century, or a new disease could have erased our story entirely. Human history was not an inevitable surge of consciousness, but a cascade of contingent events. Around 50,000 years ago, the curve finally rose. Genes, population size, stability, networks, memory, and symbols all aligned. Fire caught and never went out. From that point onward, every person lived amid symbols, meaning, and stories, and humanity never returned to the earlier state. Yet this was only the beginning. A liberated mind ushered in consequences that were simultaneously beautiful, dangerous, and irreversible. For hundreds of thousands of years, the stage was set. Genes, hands crafting weapons, occasional sparks of symbolic thought, early beads, ochre stains, and half-forgotten lines in sand. Ideas flickered, techniques rose and fell, but the system struggled to connect them until the tipping point arrived. There was no sudden leap, no grand staircase of progress, just a long, uneven pulse that stretched back through the darkness for thousands of years. The breakthrough didn't arise from a single invention. It emerged from the overlap of several modest factors that, together, unlocked everything. First came the brain. Around 50,000 years ago, the neural circuitry inside the skull of early Homo sapiens crossed an invisible threshold. It wasn't a flash of genius, but a rising complexity that allowed thoughts to nest within thoughts, to store memories over long periods, and to model futures that didn't yet exist. This capacity for imagination, anxiety, and meaning-making turned the mind into a tool for more than just reacting to the present. Second was population. For most of human history, groups were too small to sustain a complex culture. Any innovation, like spinning fiber or preserving meat, could disappear with the death of its creators. Models show that between 70 and 50,000 years ago, communities grew dense enough that cultural knowledge stopped vanishing and began to accumulate. More people gathered, not only in space, but also socially, exploding the number of possible interactions. Language accelerated, learning sped up, and errors could be corrected quickly, fostering technological advances that isolated groups could never achieve alone. New ideas emerged that no single individual could have invented on their own. The third factor was the planet's climate. After 200,000 years of erratic glaciations, droughts, and sudden cold snaps, a period of relative stability settled over key regions of Africa, Asia, and the Near East about 70 to 50,000 years ago. Rainfall steadied, coastlines became more navigable, and food webs grew predictable. This stability allowed memories to be stored externally through oral narratives, shared myths, and symbols carved on objects. Finally, expanding social networks amplified the effect. Genetic and archaeological evidence points to a rapid spread of family ties beyond isolated groups. Marriages began to link different communities, creating alliances, shared commitments, and a flow of genes and ideas across continents. The brain was primed, the numbers of people were sufficient, and the world had finally calmed enough for a public network to stretch far and wide. What happened then was not a moment of enlightenment when a lone individual invented art, religion, science, and music before breakfast. It was an emergent property of a system that, once pressed past a critical threshold, like ice melting at its melting point, changed state. Around 50,000 years ago, that threshold cracked, and from that moment, memory lived not only in brains, but also in objects, rituals, rhythms, colors, and patterns. Knowledge has turned inward, becoming knowledge about itself. History has morphed into technology, and personality lives inside a portable device. Once the dominoes began to fall, everything sped up. After 5,000 years, people crossed an open ocean to reach an unseen continent. 10,000 years later, Europeans carved lions with human heads, creatures that never existed in nature, but lived in the mind. Another 10,000 years brought agriculture, settled life, temples, and cities. The true mystery wasn't the spark of invention, but the long pause before wind, fuel, and friction finally aligned. When that mechanism stopped, there was no turning back, and its consequences arrived both inevitably
and catastrophically, for better and for worse. We now live inside that story, because its effects shape everything we know. The firelight on cave walls, steady hands shaping bone beads, and the first whispered myths under the stars never truly ended. They only accelerated. The burst of meaning 50,000 years ago wasn't a single event or a conclusion. It ignited a self-sustaining feedback loop of memory, recursion, and connections. Once set in motion, the pattern could not return to silence. When a person scratches a symbol on a wall, ties a tale to a place, or teaches a child a song, information ceases to be merely biological. It leaves the fragile flesh of the brain and becomes external memory, granting a virtually unlimited lifespan to our thoughts. The more memory escapes the skull, the faster the snowball grows. This is the true legacy of that ancient explosion. A recursive cycle between minds, objects, and symbols now accelerates non-linearly and exponentially. Each generation inherits not just its own discoveries, but those of all who came before, compressed, blended, and passed on. Ice Age shamans who traced mammoth migrations on cave walls performed the same act as modern data analysts, priests carving sacred geometry, and programmers writing code. The single scheme remains: compress information into symbols, transmit it, remix it, and build anew. When symbolic recursion caught fire, it transformed everything. From cave drawings to carved idols, from idols to rituals, from rituals to language, from language to writing, from writing to cities, treaties, calendars, and religions, from clay tablets to handwritten books, from printing presses to radio waves, from silicon chips to cloud servers. The chain of memory began with fingertips pressing limestone and now stretches to glowing data centers humming beneath our feet. It never stopped. The fire that started in the caves still burns, driving an ever-growing cycle of meaning. She leaves the fragile flesh of the brain and becomes external memory, turning symbols into a nonlinear, exponentially repeating progress. Each generation inherits not only its own discoveries, but all those of its predecessors, compressed, mixed, and reshaped. The Ice Age shaman who painted mammoth trails on cave walls did the same as today's architects, priests, and programmers who carve sacred geometry or write code. The pattern is identical. Compress information into symbols, transmit it, blend it, and create something new. First, the cave drawings turned into carved idols, idols into rituals, rituals into language, language into writing, and writing into cities, contracts, and everything that followed, from clay tablets to handwritten books, from printing presses to radio waves, from silicon chips to cloud servers. Memory began with fingertips on stone, humming beneath our feet. A question few dare to ask aloud: what if the so-called cognitive explosion never truly ended? What if the massive acceleration that began 50,000 years ago is not a past event, but an ongoing, unchecked shift that merely changes its medium? The gap in time didn't close, it simply sped up, shrinking from pigments to pixels, from ochre to code. If you step back and view human history as a slow arc, the lines blur. The difference between a hunter carving signs on stone and an engineer logging data on silicon ceases to be a civilizational leap and becomes an inevitable loop change. The past isn't distant. It never vanished. Examine any modern technology, telephone, bank account, streaming server, this very narration in your headphones, and you'll find the same structure that fed Ice Age brains.
symbols and tools layered onto reality, compressing meaning, extending memory beyond the body. The cave wall is a screen. An ochre fingerprint is an identity check. A sky constellation resembles a data graph, differing only in throughput. The true explosion was not guns, but the invention of memory outside the flesh, thoughts outliving their thinker, recursion feeding the next recursion. Each generation now starts with a wealth of accumulated memory, stories, tools, language, law, myth, mathematics, infrastructure, the scaffolding of ghosts. Subsequent leaps, agriculture, writing, metallurgy, printing, radio, internet, are merely new amplifiers attached to the same feedback loop. We narrate history as a sequence of steps, yet those steps are curves nested within curves, continuous accelerations rather than straight lines. The timeline itself is a pattern of loops, feedback, and recursion, a blend of past and future that continually unfolds. Consequently, the notion of a closed lapse of time is misleading. The memory chain never truly pauses. We are still trapped in the same ghostly silence that held us for hundreds of thousands of years. Only the loop now spins faster, louder, and more chaotic. If culture is an exponential memory system and the symbolic mind a recursive engine, no single explosion ever ends. It merely adds layers. The digital age is not a new era that replaced the Paleolithic. It is its amplified continuation. Social media feeds are like cave walls covered with endless fingerprints of strangers we will never meet. Distributed chains of records act as ever more sophisticated memory aids, the palace memories of civilization, even as we forget how to trust. Algorithms become the elder's story that repeats a never-sleeping machine. Everything remains bound by the same rules of transmission, scale, and noise. False memories spread like wildfire. Misinformation pushes out truth. Ritual emerges from repetition, and meaning battles noise until the system either breaks or stays unchanged. The question is no longer whether an explosion occurred 50,000 years ago, but whether the feedback loop we created now runs faster than the primate brain that birthed it. Is the fire of the gods a tribe that still needs warming, or a blaze already out of control? There is no steady pattern. Speed increases until something snaps, a bottleneck collapses, a revolution erupts, and the cycle accelerates again. We stare at the same alarming horizon that the first intelligent humans faced, leaving handprints on limestone 45,000 years ago. Under the starry fire, they whispered, "Who are we now?
What will we become if memory grows without limit while the mind stays the same?" Time never paused. The fire never went out. We merely changed the walls on which we draw. The recursion continues, not as a new fire that began 50,000 years ago, but as a chain reaction of memory stacked upon memory, never reaching a height that can bear its own weight. Since that moment, it has kept growing. The inconvenient truth is that the archaeological record ends in long silences, never completing its chronicle. We fill those gaps with faster guns, larger mirrors, and higher throughput technology. From ochre dots on cave walls to touchscreen pixels, from oral tales under the stars to cloud copies on rotating server farms, from clans armed with spears to clans fighting with images and jokes, the pattern persists, only accelerated. The core question, first posed by our ancestors, concerns not only events of 50,000 years past, but also our present trajectory. Will the fire we have embraced for progress, looping ever faster, ever higher, and ever finer, eventually collapse like the fragile networks before it?
The failure of time teaches that culture is impermanent and memory unguaranteed. What once seemed inevitable was merely statistical luck, buried with forgotten languages and minds. Patterns will break and fade. Most human lineages and most memories have already vanished. Almost everything we ever were is lost. The time lapse wasn't a special case, it was the rule. So the real question isn't what happened then, but how much of today's world will still exist after 50,000 years? If the servers crash, the stored memory collapses and the recursion restarts, ending again. After all, they've spent the past 100,000 years teaching alone.